So you're trying to understand these really big, complex issues, right? But maybe without getting totally lost in the weeds or all the confusing jargon.
And cutting through the noise.
That's basically what we aim for here. Welcome to the deep dive. Think of it as your way to quickly but, properly grasp what really matters from a whole lot of information out there.
And today, we're diving deep into the thinking of Professor PLO Lumumba. We're drawing from a pretty recent YouTube interview he did.
Right.
Our mission really is to pull out the key insights he shared about Kenyan leadership, the Constitution, and just the general state of the nation.
And Professor Lumumba, well, he doesn't really hold back, does he?
No, not at all.
In this interview, he gets into, well, everything. Devolution, the hopes versus the reality now. The challenges the Constitution keeps facing. Corruption, obviously. Elections, always a big topic.
Yeah.
And he even gives a pretty blunt take on the country's foreign policy moves.
And what makes his view so interesting, I think, especially for you listening, is his history. I mean, he was right there involved in the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission.
Right, at the ground level.
Exactly. So that really shapes how he sees things today, gives his perspective a unique kind of depth. You can expect some real aha moments, like his analogy about the dancer.
Oh, yeah, the dancer analogy.
Knowing when to leave the stage. And his thoughts on why Kenya hasn't quite, unlocked the full potential of that 2010 Constitution.
Okay, let's unpack that dancer analogy first. That really stuck with me. He said, no matter how good you are, if you stay for too long, you spoil it. A dancer always knows when to leave the stage. He's talking about political leaders there. What's the core message?
Well, I think the main idea is that, look, every leader has limits, right? No matter how good they seem at a certain point in time. He even brings up the Tanzanian president's view, leave when the audience still wants more. It really stresses the need for smooth transitions, for making space for new people, new ideas to come through.
Yeah, it pushes back against that idea he mentioned, the Messiah syndrome you sometimes see in politics.
Exactly.
This idea that one person is just indispensable. He's saying, look, everyone's playing a part in a bigger story. You're not the whole show.
And he makes a careful distinction, too. It's not about disappearing completely after leaving office.
Right.
He points to Nelson Mandela, who stepped down as president but was still there, offering advice when asked, but not trying to run things from behind the scenes.
Guiding, not dictating.
Precisely. Advising, not controlling.
Now, Professor Lumumba, as you said, has this deep personal link to the Constitution. He was involved in creating it, and he talks quite passionately about devolution. Can you remind us, what was the original vision, especially as he saw it?
Yeah, so drawing from his time with the Review Commission and the BOMAS conference, a big forum back in the early 2000s, where they hashed out constitutional ideas.
Right, I remember that.
The initial proposal was for just 14 devolution units. And the thinking behind that, the main reason, was twofold. Make sure these units could actually sustain themselves economically, and crucially, try to avoid creating regions that were basically just dominated by one ethnic group.
So the goal was diversity, economic strength, not sort of tribal blocks. But that's not quite what happened, is it?
No, not quite. As Lumumba describes it, that BOMAS draft ran into a lot of political roadblocks. And what Kenya ended up with was the 47 counties, mostly based on the old district lines. Lumumba's view now is that this number 47, it's just not sustainable.
Unsustainable how? Economically?
Economically, yes, but also because he feels it's actually worsened ethnic divisions. Even down to the clan level in some places, he sees it as promoting a kind of ethnic insolvency.
But he does mention some areas, like the coast, the lake region, parts of the Rift Valley, seem to be showing that larger units can work better.
But he does, yeah. He sees potential there.
So what's stopping the rest of the country from moving towards that, if it makes more sense economically and maybe socially?
Well, that gets to the heart of the challenge, doesn't it? He suggests it boils down to entrenched interests. Politicians, and maybe parts of the public too, have got used to the power, the sort of perceived tribal ownership that comes with these smaller counties.
Right. Hard to give that up.
Exactly. He uses that analogy, if you want an omelet, you must break the egg, meaning some disruption is needed for real change.
You can really hear the frustration in his voice when he talks about the Constitution being undermined, especially given his role in creating it. What does he see as the main threats?
Yeah, that pain comes through. He argues pretty forcefully that many political players just never really bought into the Constitution's core principles.
Really?
Yeah. He specifically points to things like the BBI, the Building Bridges Initiative, and NADCO, the National Dialogue Committee. He sees those as basically attempts to get around or weaken the constitutional order that was established.
So politicians using it when it suits them.
That's his view. They see it more as a political tool for short-term advantage rather than, the fundamental law that's supposed to guide the country long-term.
And it's not just about trying to change the rules, is it? He also criticizes the failure to actually do what the Constitution says.
Absolutely. That's a huge part of his critique. He rattles off a whole list of areas where he feels the Constitution's promise hasn't been delivered.
Like what?
Well, devolution itself not fully realized. Chapter 6 on leadership integrity and ethics often ignored. Proper financial management, transparent public appointments, quality education, human rights, foreign policy principles, gender equality, fair electoral systems.
Wow, that's quite a list.
It is. It amounts to a pretty strong indictment of the, perhaps, lack of political will to really live by the Constitution.
He uses that image, doesn't he? Being in a hole, but just keep digging.
Yeah, that analogy really hits home. It suggests that instead of climbing out by sticking to the Constitution, the country's digging deeper, making the problems worse by deviating further. And he also worries about where these big national issues get discussed. He mentions funerals, weddings, even some churches becoming platforms for political point scoring instead of real debate.
Okay, let's talk about the IEBC, the Electoral Commission. It's always controversial. What's Lumumba's take on the core problem there?
He thinks the fundamental issue isn't so much the structure or the appointment process itself, though he notes how costly it all is. No, for him, the real problem is just deep, deep mistrust among the political players. He basically says everyone wants to game the system, to put their people in place to manipulate the outcome.
So it's about the intent behind the appointments.
That's how he sees it, yeah.
He does mention parliamentary vetting of nominees. Does he think that helps?
He supports the idea of rigorous vetting in Parliament, yes, but he immediately points out the catch-22. Parliament itself faces questions about its own impartiality, right?
Sure.
So it's this cycle of mistrust. And he sees things like, constantly printing ballot papers overseas as just another symptom of this lack of faith in local processes and institutions.
And this ties back to the issue of ethnicity in politics again, doesn't it?
It always seems to, yeah. He really stresses the need for a new generation of leaders to move beyond what he calls these primordial instincts of ethnicity.
So how do you do that with something like the IEBC? How do you pick commissioners without it becoming an ethnic headcount?
His answer is pretty straightforward. Judge people on their merits. Look at their integrity, their track record. Do they have a history of corruption or crime? That should be the focus, he argues, not their ethnic background or who they know.
Right.
He even throws out that hypothetical, should the UN just run Kenyan elections? Which shows just how low the trust is sunk, in his view.
Shifting gears a bit to recent events, the Reject Finance Bill protests, mostly led by young people, that felt like a big moment. How did Lumumba see it?
Oh, he saw it as absolutely huge, a real turning point. He said it was the moment young Kenyans conquered fear.
Conquered fear. Strong words.
Yeah. He believes the country won't be the same again, that the seed for a different kind of civic engagement has been planted.
And even though the big street protests died down, he notes young people are still very active online, right?
Exactly. He points to that sustained online conversation, the activism, and suggests it's genuinely making politicians nervous.
Interesting.
So his message to those young people and anyone else who wants change is get organized, use your vote, make it count in the next election. But again, he pleads for these serious discussions to happen in proper forums, not, hijacking funerals or weddings for politics. Despite everything, though, he sounds cautiously optimistic because of this youth energy.
Okay, cautious optimism is good, but the big question is always how, right? How do you turn that energy into real change? Especially when, as he said, trust is so broken.
Yeah, the how is tricky. He uses an analogy, good generals don't broadcast their battle plans. But he's emphasized some key things. Young people need to register, they need to vote, they need to organize from the ground up.
Yeah.
Yes. And he calls for political groups to actually focus on national issues, on real policies, not just rally around personalities or, as he puts it, these low-voltage warlords, the tribal or regional kingpins.
So he still believes in the democratic tools available.
Very much so. Use the democratic instruments, he says, but do it peacefully. Protect the country's stability. He fully acknowledges that rebuilding trust is a massive task, probably an intergenerational one.
Yeah.
And he also critiques the media focus, how a few politicians seem to dominate the headlines all the time. He suggests maybe shifting the spotlight, giving more airtime to younger voices, focusing on substantive issues rather than just political soundbites from funerals.
Let's switch to foreign policy. He wasn't exactly complimentary there either.
No, definitely not. He was quite blunt. Described recent foreign policy as moving from blunder to blunder.
Ouch. Any specific examples?
He mentioned the deal with the Dominican Republic for the Haiti security mission. He questioned the whole logic of it, the capacity of the Dominican Republic. And he also criticized the foreign minister flying out there personally, suggesting the ambassador in D.C. could have handled it. Little things, maybe, but they add up in his view.
Were there other areas he pointed to?
Yeah, he listed off issues with relations concerning the DRC, Sudan, South Sudan, Sahrawi Republic, even within the East African community itself.
So, quite widespread concerns.
Yes. He chalks some of it up to what he calls a Nairobi mentality, maybe a bit of arrogance, a failure to listen to experienced diplomats, former ambassadors who actually know the landscape.
Okay, let's dig into the economy. What does Professor Lumumba see as the root causes of Kenya's economic struggles?
He identifies a kind of perfect storm of factors. There's the huge public debt, obviously, policy mistakes, deep-rooted corruption, and of course, global economic pressures play a role too.
Right.
But domestically, he points to things like a harsh tax system, really high electricity costs, lots of excise duties, all creating a tough climate for businesses and investors.
What about key sectors?
He sees major challenges in agriculture, tourism, manufacturing. The traditional engines of the economy aren't firing properly, and he sort of dismisses the whole World Bank versus IMF borrowing debate, saying, look, it's debt either way, it's fundamentally the same pressure.
And the government itself, its structure.
He's critical there too. Says the government is too expensive, too top-heavy, lots of waste, embezzlement. Plus, you've got the devolved units, the counties, many struggling to raise enough revenue to cover their spending. And overall, it's an economy focused too much on consuming, not enough on producing. And a failure, he thinks, to really use the expertise that is available in the country.
Now, there's been some debate about the date for the next election. What's Professor Lumumba's position on when it should constitutionally happen?
He's very clear on this. He states the next general election is due on August 10th, 2027.
Okay, specific date.
Yes, the second Tuesday of August in the 5th year after the previous election. He knows others interpret the Constitution differently, but he sounds very confident in his reading, based on legal principles and how similar laws are read elsewhere.
During the interview, someone brought up this feeling that maybe Kenyans seem a bit heartless when politicians face personal tragedies. How did Lumumba respond to that?
It was an interesting point. He sort of acknowledged why people might feel that way, suggesting it's maybe a reaction to perceived heartlessness from some politicians when they were in power. Hurt people perhaps. But ultimately, he appealed for compassion. He said, we need to regain our humanity, help even your enemy when they're down.
That leads to another question he was asked. Would he ever run for office again?
He talked about his past runs and his feeling that too often Kenyan voters go for money or ethnicity, not ideas.
Right.
He made that quite pointed comment that the electorate are co-authors of their own misfortune in that sense.
Strong words again.
Yeah. So, would he run? He said maybe if the time was right, but he doesn't think it is right now.
Yeah.
But he feels a duty to keep trying to make the time right, by pushing for ideas over ethnicity.
The legal system, the judiciary, also came up. A caller raised concerns about costs and complexity. What did Lumumba say?
He acknowledged those very real problems, high legal fees, courts being slow and complicated. He did mention pro bono services exist through the Law Society and individual lawyers.
But it's a bigger issue.
Yes. He sees a deeper problem with how justice is administered, especially when powerful political figures are involved. And he was incredibly critical of the judiciary itself.
How critical.
He used words like pathetic, even the worst he's seen. He talked about evidence, both data and stories, suggesting corruption justice being on sale, facilitation fees. He pointed to the strange situation of the Chief Justice litigating in her own courts, controversies over how judges are assigned to cases. He lamented the lack of accountability, people not resigning when things go wrong. His conclusion was painful, he said, but necessary. The Supreme Court needs to be reconstituted to restore trust.
That's a major statement.
It really is.
Okay, let's talk about the NGCDF, the Constituency Development Fund. It was ruled unconstitutional, but now there are moves to bring it back by changing the Constitution itself.
That's right. He confirmed, yep, it was declared unconstitutional. And he's strongly against these current efforts to amend the Constitution to make NGCDF and other similar funds like Senate funds, ward funds, constitutional.
What's his main objection? Is it the idea of money going to constituencies?
No, not necessarily the idea of allocating funds for local development. His issue is with who controls the money. He argues having MPs and MCAs preside over how these funds are used is the problem.
Why? Risk of misuse.
Exactly. He worries MPs might have companies trading with these funds, that it becomes a sort of slush fund for influence peddling, as he put it. His argument is, fine, allocate the money, but let it go through the devolved county structures, with Parliament providing oversight, not direct control.
And he's actively campaigning against this?
Yes, he mentioned submitting a memo arguing against it to Parliament, the President, the Anti-Corruption Commission, MPs warning them about bypassing the Constitution just to legalize something previously found illegal.
But given these efforts often seem to succeed despite public opposition, like with the NADCO report, a caller asked, what can people actually do? Is it a lost cause?
Lumumba took the long view. He acknowledged the concern, but insisted these things often get undone eventually. He pointed to history, big changes in Europe, South Africa, saying, don't get discouraged by setbacks now.
So keep pushing. Keep pushing.
Right.
He even mentioned looking at decolonization efforts happening now in parts of Africa, rethinking education. He also personally favors fast-tracking an East African political federation. The key, he stressed, is not to give in to fear.
Right.
He was quite dismissive of current public participation processes, calling them often misleading. And he linked these funds directly back to the problem of money politics corrupting democracy.
Despite all these heavy criticisms, he did identify some positives, some constitutional wins since 2010, right?
Yes, absolutely. It wasn't all negative. He highlighted the increased freedom of expression as a major gain.
Okay.
The fact that politicians now actually face pushback from the public, real gains in human rights, even with ongoing challenges, more political space generally. Devolution, while flawed in implementation, is still progress. The mainstreaming of some marginalized groups, people with disabilities, women, and just the emergence of a more questioning society overall.
So there are foundations to build on. Yes. He thinks the Constitution needs review, but for genuine improvement, not just to serve politicians' short-term goals, like he feels BBI and NADT did.
Well, Professor Lumumba certainly gave us a very thorough, sometimes quite tough analysis of Kenya's challenges, but also, as you say, hinted at the opportunities if things can be tackled differently. It's definitely a lot to take in, but hopefully for you listening, this deep dive has made his perspective clearer, maybe faster than wading through it all yourself.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground. Hopefully we hit on some of those key moments, those analogies like the dancer, the insights into the Constitution. We know it's complex, but the goal was really to distill it down for you, offer some clarity.
And maybe the final thought to leave you with as we wrap up is that guarded optimism Lumumba expressed. Despite all the critique, he ends with a call for action, for sustained engagement, for organization, for sticking to democratic principles as the way forward. It definitely makes you think about, well, what's your role in shaping Kenya's future?
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it gave you plenty to consider.
Until the next time.